I guess the fundamental question is, do you believe that's always going to be necessary for there to be a level of control, i.e. manipulation, over the money that a society uses? Can we not have a completely market-based and market-managed money?
We can't. Because I think the reality is the life is a form of the matrix that for the majority, life sucks, and it always has, and it always will, and therefore we have to create artificial paradises, and we need the artifice of fiat money to do so. That it's rather, I'd rather keep the broads. I'd rather keep the majority. Remember, we live under the tyranny of the majority, and if keeping them at bay requires, and believe me, I think it does require a fiat, which is to say an infinitely expandable currency, then so be it. So my point, turning back to you, is, so let's say there is this, and I don't disagree with this, there is an inherent flaw in the dollar as the reserve currency. It's not that we give it, because Vijay was saying, this exorbitant privilege. It has no exorbitant privilege. That's just Chinese and Russian propaganda. And I'll expand upon that in another lifetime. But the money supply has expanded because we've had wars starting by continuum from the Vietnam War to Iraq to God knows what, to the Russians in Crimea. They don't get off. And we've had inflation. And I mentioned that the gold supply may double over 70 years. That's just 2% growth per annum. So, over a while, these things become a big deal. But my point is, if I'm a kind of intelligent, savvy person, I still don't see what Bitcoin, I do see what it brings to me. But it's one of many things which are available. So if I have been successful in generating capital, wealth, and lots of it, or just a little bit, but it's something that's precious and I want to preserve, then the system that we have today, like I say, it's okay. So if there's a great fear that we're going to have hyperinflation, if I look, let me just talk personally. Well, I'm on this tiny little island. It's one of 5 locations in the world that the really, really, really rich people want to be. They want to be here because it's wonderful, right? And it's like a Bitcoin mine. They're not making another island like this, right? What's here is here. The house that I built 2012, the planning permission has got stricter and stricter. You'd never be able to build that. So it's almost like a reverse engineering. The supply is getting tighter and tighter. What's more, I can borrow money from banks at the wrong price. I can fix it for 20 years. And effectively, I can create a transfer of wealth from the shareholders of that bank to me. And I can buy gold. I can put my money in the stock market. I could buy variance swaps. I could go out there and I could buy a 50,000 call option on the S&P over the next 20 years. And the price of that call option will be wrong. It'll be way, way, way too cheap. And if it ever strikes, the US government will guarantee it because I bought it on an exchange. So why do I want to change the system?
Vijay?
Well, I think we're moving to a future where people are going to start acting and thinking more like global citizens. I mean, look at Hugh, he's in St. Bart's, and John, you're a Canadian who lives in Thailand. I'm an Australian who lives in America. And people are going to want to move to where their capital is treated the best. And Hugh mentioned, some assets and using call options. But which of these assets is not a liability of some third party that you have to trust? They all are, except Bitcoin. Well, gold is too, but gold is a real pain in the butt to move. And if you want to take your capital to another place, and I think in the future people are going to think like this. Well, I don't like being in the US anymore. I'm going to move somewhere else. What if governments become stricter about this and impose capital controls? And they certainly have in various countries around the world. Even in the US, if you look at it closely, we have these sort of de facto capital controls. It's very difficult to leave the US without Uncle Sam taking a big cut of your savings. So I think we're moving to a digital world, a one in which people will want to move where they're treated the best, and they won't have an affiliation to any particular nation state. And it'll be a world where people want something like Bitcoin so that they could move without their savings being eroded or confiscated. And, we're talking a little bit about Hugh's fears about Bitcoin becoming a reserve currency. That's fine, it's legitimate to have some concerns, but I almost view this as inevitable, because central banks right now are charting this very perilous course between Scylla and Charybdis. And on the one hand, you have hyperinflation and the destruction of the currency. And on the other hand, you have hyperdeflation, which is the destruction of the economy and social unrest. And lurking below the surface is Bitcoin that's ready to devour the whole rotten system. So I sort of view this as inevitable. The policies and the course that have been chosen by central banks are leading to this inevitable denouement. And so whether you're afraid of it or you're excited about it, I think it's going to happen. So you have to deal with it.
Okay. So again, good. So I've spent a lot of time not coming back to you on a point which I find I don't have a comfort level with. One of the supposed advantages of Bitcoin is its portability. So it's not supposed. Clearly, that is an advantage. It's portable, like you say. You could, just hop on a plane anywhere. But it's not perfect. It's not $1 trillion of infallibility. And there'll be a good answer to this, I'm sure, but and I'm sure you'll find it. But let me put it back to you. But with societies in some of these exotic places, Thailand. I was in Thailand. When do I want to say? Would it be 2012 when the riots went off? I was in Bangkok when an explosion went off. When all hell was being unleashed. And closer, well, not closer to home, but closer to today's days. The events in Myanmar, probably pronouncing it in a grotesque manner. But what's the first thing that the state does? It kills the Wi-Fi. It takes the internet system down. Yeah, and so there. Maybe this is a very ignorant point, but in terms of you want to encourage me to put how much of my wealth into this asset. Probably right now it should be 1 or 2% of my wealth. But even then, I'm thinking, but in adversity, with no Wi-Fi, I kind of feel a little bit naked. So come back to me on that. And then I want to come back to you on the insanity, or rather the lack of, with regard to the present generation of central banks.
Yeah, certainly that's a very valid concern. If you're living in a nation where the government can shut off the internet, then it may not be useful for transacting in the moment. But I like to think of the historical case of Europe during World War II, when you had tens of thousands of Jews fleeing in front of the Nazis, trying to get out and trying to get to the US. And I think in particular of the great Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, who was very well regarded in Europe. He was a famous professor in Vienna. And he got to America and he had absolutely no savings whatsoever, and he had to rebuild his life, and he could barely get an assistant professorship at a second-tier university. So it was a real fall in his standard of living. Now, if he had something like Bitcoin, maybe he wouldn't have been able to transact with it and buy bread or whatever, because the governments had shut down the internet in Europe. But he would have something that was liquid and valuable when he got to his final destination. So I think you have a valid point there, Hugh. You could be in a place perhaps like India, where they're talking about banning Bitcoin. But if you have savings in Bitcoin, you can go somewhere else where it is valued, which is most of the rest of the world. It's one of the deepest, most liquid markets on earth now. That tens of billions of dollars of Bitcoin are traded per day. So it's valued all over the place. but I agree with you that to the limited extent, if you're stuck somewhere where the government is antagonistic and is willing to shut down the entire internet and the consequences that come with that, then it may be difficult to transact in Bitcoin. Mitigating that a little bit is that people have set up satellite communication so that you can receive and transact on the Bitcoin network, even if you don't have an internet connection, if you have just a satellite connection. There's one other thing that I wanted to bring up that we haven't talked about. I just think we have a perfect macro setup right now for a speculative attack on various fiat currencies, including the dollar. And you can already see this happening. There's a company called MicroStrategy. I don't know if Hugh is aware of them, but they're borrowing at 0% hundreds of millions of dollars with the express purpose of buying Bitcoin with that, and the bond market is funding them. So if this sort of picks up pace and more companies follow suit, Tesla just bought $1.5 billion worth of Bitcoin. But if companies start figuring out that they can borrow at 0% and buy an asset which is appreciating 200% per year on average over the last decade, you're going to get a speculative attack on the dollar. It's unclear if that's going to happen in the near future, but we have a perfect setup for something like that to happen. I'd love to hear Hugh's thoughts on that.
No, you don't. That's just being silly. So, unless you're Danish, you ain't borrowing at zero. You either have an amortization, or you have a collateral risk in that you might go interest rate only. But even your interest rate, I'm borrowing 20-year fixed at 2%. I know people who are fixed at 1.3. If you're what's deemed to be a risk-free entity in the United States, a very safe business, you'll certainly be able to borrow 5-10-year money with a 2 handle, but not a 0 handle. And then you have the collateral risk. Tesla's, and Elon, it's the circus. He's the ringmaster. He's wonderful. I love him for it. But that's not real world. It's not real world where a corporate treasurer is going to have $1 billion in something where I would attribute a very high probability that Bitcoin could have a 50% drawdown in the next 18 months without it negating the merits of the system. It's just the nature of markets. I mean, how many times has Tesla had a 50% drawdown? How many times did we see 35% plus drawdowns in that great arc where the NASDAQ went to 5,000? In the last 3 years, stocks, which probably went up tenfold, periodically dropped between 35 and 60% to shake you out. So Bitcoin, I don't think will be any different. So the thing about Bitcoin is it's very hard to create. It's very hard to create the reflexivity that people talk about, where people are compelled to buy just because it's going up, because that really lends itself to the dumb world of these passive investors in equities, where I get no issue. I've never been short Tesla. It's fantastic fun to watch from the sidelines, which is where I am. But it went up 8-10-fold last year. I mean, some absurd. I say it's an absurd notion because you would have thought that the sum of all of our knowledge at the beginning of the previous year would have been reflected in the price, and yet somehow it wasn't. And that thing that wasn't reflected, of course, was as it got bigger, then there are huge stocks of money which are compelled to buy it without reason. And that creates a reflexive flow, which creates these astonishing arcs into the heavens. I don't see that. I don't see that with Bitcoin. But what I do see, and what I want to come back with a question to you guys, is what I see is a kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul, in that of late, the relationship has turned around within the alternative sphere, whereby it seems that the rise and rise of Bitcoin it's not being fueled, but there's definitely a casualty, which is gold. And gold has the correlation is just blown. And the question I have is, if you look at the Bitcoin to gold ratio, it kind of traded stably around about 5 times, and then blew out to 17, and now it's like heading to 30. Has anyone thought about where where that should trade, and what that's telling us.
Yeah, so I've written about this a little bit, and it's interesting to me because Bitcoin and gold are sort of close cousins as financial assets. They both have properties that make them good as money, but the ownership distribution of gold and Bitcoin is very, very different. If you look at the ownership distribution of gold, it's one, largely central banks, which hold bars of gold in their vaults. Number two is people owning gold jewelry, and there's a lot of this in India and the Middle East. And number three, the family offices around the world which own some allocation to gold as an investment. Whereas Bitcoin, if you look at the ownership distribution, it's largely people who are much younger, people who are technologically savvy, millennials, and computer scientists, people who got in early still hold a large fraction of the Bitcoin. So the ownership distribution is very, very different. But I think in this cycle, we are already starting to see demand for, these are both non-sovereign stores of value. We're seeing demand shifting from gold over to Bitcoin. And you would expect in this environment, gold would be doing amazing, negative interest rates across the globe. This is the perfect macro setup for gold. But gold really has stalled. It's just stuck. And I think that's because we're starting to see demand, especially from family offices, shifting over to Bitcoin. And you'll hear stories of family offices who are starting to increase their allocation to Bitcoin, probably at the expense of gold, because they sort of sit in the same category. So you talked about this correlation breaking. That's where I think that's happening. We're probably not going to see demand from the other two sources of demand for gold shift over to Bitcoin yet, or at least for a long time. Central banks and the jewelry demand's obviously not going to shift over. But family offices and the investment demand for gold, I think, is going to shift to Bitcoin during this market cycle.